Welcome back to CodingCat.dev, where we give you cats the freshest dose of dev snacks. Here is Alex Patterson and Brittany Postma. This episode brought to you by Storyblok. Build anything and publish everywhere. Welcome back, perfect peeps. Today I have a special guest with us. I'm going to get the inflection wrong, I guarantee it. So I'm going to say it's Angel. You can correct me, though.
Angel works fine. Hi, Alex.
So we have Angel on to talk about his book that he's releasing called Front Web Framework. Build a Front End Web Framework. There we go. And kind of we're going to break down like why you're writing it and more about you and stuff like that. So I'm really excited for you to come on and talk with us about it.
Yeah, excited as well.
Can you tell me can we break into your background a little bit and like what kind of the reasons that led up to making the book?
I think it is because I am a very curious person. Ever since I was a little kid, I was one of those kids asking like lots of questions to my parents, like why this, why that, why, you know, these kids. And my parents were nice enough to satisfy my all my doubts. But I've been like that like forever. I always like to understand how things work. I always look under the covers. I always try to understand how things are done. And when I was a kid and I was given a remote control car, I would disassemble it, like play with it, maybe 2 days at most. I was bored already. I needed to understand what was inside. If anything had any electronics, I needed to disassemble it and understand what's going on inside. So I guess it all started when I was starting with front-end frameworks. I remember using Vue for the first time and feeling amazed. So actually, the first one that I used was Angular, but my curiosity started to kick in when I tried Vue for the first time. And because I saw how the data would change, and then immediately, like the UI, what you were seeing, would reflect that change, and I was like, how did this happen? How is it so easy for me to implement an application and everything happen like this? Because it might sound stupid because most of the front-end modern developers take this for granted. But in the old days, I had to do all of this programmatically with JavaScript, writing a lot of code just to know when something changed. And then you had to go to the DOM, pick the right element, and patch the DOM yourself, right? So, but now I take this for granted.
Was your background like? Did you go to school to learn how to code, like in general, or what did that look like for you?
So I did study mechanical engineering.
Okay.
Well, it's actually industrial engineering, which in Spain used to be a mix between mechanical, electrical, and a lot of disciplines together, which is great because it's exactly what I like. I like to be a generalist, know a little bit of everything. I don't consider myself a specialist on anything. And we were taught how to program in the first year, and I fell in love with programming. So I've been programming ever since.
Were you writing like C programming for engineering?
We started with Pascal.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't know if people now know about Pascal, but yeah, I use Pascal. And then from there, I studied myself C++, and wrote lots of programs with C++. And then was Java and then a few others. But in the old days, I used C++, yeah.
Nice. So, I mean, you had a lot of formal like language before you started into the front end. It's kind of interesting to always hear people's journeys as they kind of go through it. So, yeah. So back to your point on kind of the hardship, if you will, of people before frameworks, especially before Angular 1 came out, or Angular JS for those in the know. It was very difficult to update a lot of what was happening in the browser, and you were having to do like, document find this thing and go update that thing. So it's really interesting that you kind of attacked it in a different way. It sounds like you learned about the frameworks and started using them, but then you really needed to know more, kind of getting back to that original statement about tearing everything apart. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I know that when I was writing applications without framework, I did this, and now I'm using a framework, and everything happens out of the box. Like I am missing everything in the middle. How did this happen? So I
think people take it for granted if they've never like gone through the pain, and a lot of people don't. I spent years in my career not understanding exactly what was happening. I just knew like this if statement made this thing happen, and like it was just the way you learned. So that's really fun. I think we're going to take a quick break and jump into our sponsorship role, and then we're going to come back and talk all about like the process for writing your book.
Absolutely. Great.
How in the world could I forget about this?
There's no need to freak out. We have Storyblock.
Robert, you're right.
But we still need a bath.
Okay, how much time do we have left until the launch?
24 hours.
Okay, let's go.
We are ready to publish.
So let's get this baby online.
Thank you again, Storyblok, for sponsoring the podcast. Really appreciate it. So yeah, diving back in, we're kind of at that point where like you were learning front-end language. You've learned, it sounded like kind of Angular, you did some stuff, and then you got into Vue and you're like, what is happening? So is that really ultimately what drove you to write the book?
There are a few other things, but I think that's where everything started. Everything
Okay.
started with me starting using Vue and saying like, oh my God, I need to understand how this works. And yeah, basically cloning the repository. Something I like to do, and when I
Sure.
have time, I try to do is go all the way back to the first commit in a repository.
Oh my goodness, that's
First commit.
crazy, right?
But it is the best way to understand like what's the core behind the project, the framework, whatever. Because usually the first commits, they already have like the main idea there.
Yeah.
And then what I would do is go one commit after the next one, just looking at how things evolve. And that helps you understand how the author was building that library, that framework, which is very interesting. I did that with Vue, started debugging, starting with that process, and I was amazed.
So was it Evan Yu's first commit that you kind of broke into there?
Exactly.
Wow, that's nuts. That's many commits ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do the git log, but you reverse the order, and then the first one you get there, that's the first commit ever. So you start with there.
So at that same time, as you're kind of like getting into this and discovering this, I have to imagine like you're still working while you're attempting to break this stuff down. Are you fully developing on front end framework at this point?
I am working at a company, but not building a front-end framework. I am a full-stack developer. So I only work on the book and on the framework that we write in the book on my free time. It's usually in the morning. I wake up very early and I write in the mornings because after working, my brain just doesn't work.
Yeah, that's fair. So the interesting part for me, most people would just say, oh, okay, like we're using a framework. I need it to do X, Y, and Z, and like you'll learn the framework. Sounds like you're kind of, that was frustrating for you and you wanted to take it a step further. So I'm kind of curious though, in what way did you learn like JavaScript? Was it you learned because of a framework, or did you know JavaScript before you dove into anything?
So the first time that I tried JavaScript, I was a very little kid in high school. So we had this computer lab with the Macintosh. The Macintosh was like, it was super colorful. I don't remember it.
No, like Apple II maybe or something?
I don't remember. It was in the old 90 or early 2000s, whatever, something around that.
Sure.
So we would surf the internet. And again, I was curious to know how the web pages work. And I learned how to open the source code for the pages. And I saw the JavaScript, and then I learned how to do very basic things. That was the first time. But then when I got into college and started learning how to program, and then I started doing some small JavaScript things on my own.
Nice.
And it was only then when I started working as a software engineer that I started building real applications. But the first things that I attempted, I never used a framework. The first framework I used was much later, and it was Angular. I think it was Angular 4, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh,
So
wow.
not that long ago.
Sure. Okay, so that's interesting. I was kind of curious, like the progression there. And we try to teach people that if you're just learning, like learn JavaScript first, because then you'll know like each framework's path and like why they did things the way that they did things. So it's kind of interesting to see it that way. I'm going to bring up the book. Maybe. Here we go. So I want to show off just the cover and kind of what you're working on, and let's break this down a little bit so you can tell the listeners on what your methodology is for creating this framework.
Right. So the main idea of the book is that there are a few things that mostly all frame or front-end frameworks have in common, architectural decisions, how things work internally, that I believe are super interesting for front-end developers to know about, for several reasons that we can go into. And in this book, I'm taking those parts and trying to simplify them as much as I can and building an entire framework. We build it from scratch. Like only in the last chapters we use third-party libraries, because in the last chapters we do some advanced things, and it would be crazy to do everything from scratch. But for the most part, we build a very simple yet functional framework. So to show what are the main ideas, the main concepts behind the big frameworks out there. So we are not trying to build the next Vue or the next React. We're not trying to build something which is production ready, which is full of features and everyone can use. We're trying to understand, to learn, to be curious about how things work under the covers for these frameworks. And the methodology is that in the first chapter, I give you an introduction of what's going on. The second chapter, we build a very simple application with just pure JavaScript, like we did in the old times, because that's how I started and how this book probably got born. And then in the next chapter, what we do is say, okay, what was the pain point? We were writing everything from scratch, and you needed to write like the business logic together with the code that manipulates the DOM. That doesn't scale. So let's try to abstract that into something that we call the virtual DOM. So we build our own virtual DOM from scratch. And then we need one more chapter to improve that virtual DOM and one extra chapter to add state management to the equation. And those two things together, in just 3 chapters, you have your first version of a front-end framework working, where all of the manipulation of the DOM is removed from you. And then every chapter onwards is just improving on what we have. And all the chapters, they start the same way. Like, okay, what was the previous main pain point? So far, we have this framework, but it's not easy to do this or that. So let's try to address that. And we keep building on top of it. And by the end of the book, the framework that the readers are going to build from scratch, absolutely from scratch, it's a very basic one. They can use it for their own projects. It's going to work, but most importantly, it's going to be super fun to build.
Yeah.
This is the main principle of the book. It needs to be fun, because people don't write front-end frameworks just for it needs to be fun.
Yeah.
And you're going to understand what goes inside a front-end framework, the big parts.
I'm kind of curious, just looking at like the breakdown of the chapters and things. Do individuals need to understand or have knowledge coming into the book at all? Do they need to know HTML or JavaScript or anything when they first start?
Yes, they need to know HTML, JavaScript, CSS, the basics. And I'm trying not to go too advanced on JavaScript. I'm trying to write this book for most people doing regular front-end development, but that they need to bring that before reading the book.
Gotcha. And when we start to look at like the framework side of things, frameworks like Next.js or Vue or Nuxt, more specifically, when we talk about JavaScript like running on the server, SSR, or like statically, do you get into like those nuances and what it would take to build a framework that can work anywhere?
In the last chapter, which is probably going to be a long chapter, so I'll probably end up splitting it in 2 or 3, we touch on server-side rendering and the rehydration algorithm, which I believe it's so important nowadays because it's in almost every framework, if not all of them. That I think it's interesting that readers can build one server-side rendering system of their own, and they can understand what the rehydration is about, and they do it. So we will cover that in the last chapter or chapters, depending on how long that is. But absolutely, I believe it's super interesting.
Yeah, it's really an amazing concept, and it kind of is interesting where we've come. Like we used to just write straight up HTML, and then it was a few dashes of JavaScript got in there, and then we were writing full server side like PHP type of programs and getting those pages out. And then it's kind of had this massive shift when Angular came back, and it was all pure client side. And now it's kind of this mix, and we're finally getting into distributed world. So it's pretty cool to understand like the SSR and rehydration or hydration of things as they come up. Some of the interesting things, and I don't know if you'll touch on in the book, but like server streaming out to the client is really cool too.
I don't think we're gonna have room for
Yeah, that seems
topic.
pretty advanced.
That would be so much fun to write and to read, probably. I mean, that can be a good idea for a second book.
Yeah, for sure. So when you sat down, is this your first book that you're writing?
This is the second, but it's very different from the first one. So it's the first book I write on writing JavaScript applications.
Sure. So when you kind of sat down to plan this out, what was your mindset going into it? Like how deep did you have to like teach people JavaScript first, or like what was that like to create the actual book?
So one of the first things that I did is write down what are the qualifications of the reader that's going to read the book, and then I build on top of that. So I said, okay, readers um, coming to this book, they need to know this and that and that. So that's not something I'm going to cover myself, because otherwise the book is going to grow a lot in size. So I'm going to take this for granted, and they are skills that mostly every front-end developer is going to be comfortable with. So it's not going to be a lot. And then to plan the book, what I like to do is like sit down, take a pen and a paper, no laptop, no screen, nothing. And then I try to explain what I want to explain to someone imaginary. Obviously, there's no one with me, but I try to like break down the concepts so that imagining that I'm explaining that to someone. And that helps me a lot, like breaking down complex things into what is the natural order I need to explain things and how I'm gonna tackle this and that. So that's usually what I do. I did it for the entire book, but every time I'm gonna start a chapter, the first thing I do is sit down and try to explain what I'm gonna be writing in the chapter to my imaginary friend. And from that, I usually come up with a good way of explaining things.
Nice. I really like that. That's really cool. Something for me, which I appreciate. I'm going to reshare my screen here. I'm a very visual learner. So when I'm reading, like the words kind of just get kind of messed up in my head and it's not really making sense. So I really love the fact like you have so much visualization built into the book too. Are these things that you had help with, or are you having to make all these UML diagrams and things?
I'm doing everything myself. Yeah, I'm drawing lots of diagrams, lots of diagrams. The last chapter I wrote, which is chapter 7, I use 30 diagrams because it's the chapter where we start explaining the reconciliation algorithm, which is complicated.
Yeah.
And the main concepts I broke them down into lots of figures and lots of explanations. So it's digestible to the public. So I think I'm the same as you. I like to have lots of graphics. I like to break down ideas in graphics, and I believe with a graphic you can explain so much.
Have you taken and like as you're building out this book, you're making graphics, have you had any like aha moments yourself where you're like, I didn't know that?
Lots of them.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when you try to explain something to someone, which is basically what you do when you write a book, you finally start understanding so many things that you thought you understood,
Right.
but you force yourself to put them into words, because we tend to think in, like, our brain works abstractly, and when you're trying to explain what it's abstract in your mind to someone with concrete words, you suddenly realize that maybe you don't know that as well as you thought. So it's a great exercise, and I'm learning so much myself by doing that.
Yeah. So I've sat down to write like a JavaScript tutorial, but it's kind of interesting. Like as you're reading docs and you're diving further in of things that like you haven't realized yet, it's amazing what you take for granted too. Like especially in frameworks that you don't realize. I'm kind of curious, like outside of those aha moments, did you have anything from like the web API itself that you learned that you were able to like put into the book too?
From web APIs, maybe not that much, because I was using them a lot before using frameworks. I was doing all of the DOM programming myself, but I had a few aha moments during when I was creating the framework. So the first thing I did is create a framework of my own, and from there I decided what I wanted to to use for the book and how I was going to explain everything, right? So I thought I could build a framework. Like before I started, I was like, yeah, I mean, I've been reading, I've been looking at the code of other frameworks. I think I'm ready to make my own. And then you start coding and you're like, wow, I have no idea how to do this, or I have absolutely no clue about how I should be doing this. And I had lots of aha moments, like when I finally came up with a solution and I was like, oh, this is how it works. And then I opened the source code of other projects. I compare what they did with what I did. And I'm like, okay, now I understand why this works this or that other way. So I had so many of those aha moments that it's hard to choose one, honestly.
That's crazy. What's the framework that you typically compare back to? Is it usually Vue?
I like Vue a lot, but then I found a lot of very interesting ideas in one that's Mithril. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Mithril.
Material?
It is very, very simple. It doesn't have a lot of code, but it does mostly everything that a front-end framework does. And it was very fun reading the code, understanding how it works. And sometimes I went back to that one to see how they were doing things to compare. Other times I went to Vue, because what I'm doing in this book is I'm trying to find the simplest way one can build a framework. So I have to borrow ideas from these frameworks, sometimes for these others, sometimes I make something up myself. But what I wanted to hear is build something that it's simple enough so a lot of people can understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So I've been looking at a lot of frameworks. Yeah.
And for those people that are using frameworks regularly, would you suggest this for them too, just to like learn deeper into like how the VDOM works and how like nodes work and things like that?
Absolutely. I would absolutely. I think this knowledge is essential. I mean, like you can program without knowing this, you can use frameworks, but it is going to give you a different perspective when you know what's going on inside. And sometimes you run into trouble, you need to troubleshoot things. And if you don't understand how the front end framework that you're using works, it's hard. It happened to me multiple times. And that's all the reason why I finally decided that I need to learn what's going on inside Vue. It helps a lot. I think this is valuable for absolutely every programmer. And in the end, it's how these frameworks, most of them are working and how we used to work before frameworks.
Yeah.
So this knowledge, I believe it's fundamental.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really cool. I lost my question here. Hang on one sec. Yeah, so the other thing I wanted to ask, kind of like when you're building a framework like this, it's often difficult to kind of see results in a book, right? So are there GitHub repos or anything that are associated as kind of you're walking through it that a person follows along with?
Yeah, there is a GitHub repo that it's public and that it's halfway through. Like I am working in this repo the same way that we typically work in the software industry. So I open pull requests for every chapter. In the pull request, I have the changes that go into each chapter. That it also helps me build the listings for the chapter, because this is not something that we build different things on every chapter. So we build something and then the next chapter we improve on it. And the next chapter we go back and improve it even more or add this and that, right? So it's super incremental. So the open source repository is there for everyone to not only see the final code, but you can find all of the listings. And you can also see the progress. So you can go at the commit history and you'll see all of the pull requests that I'm merging in order. So I'm also adding tags. So in case you want to check out the tag of a particular chapter to see what's the end of that chapter, to see the framework by the end of the chapter, you can also do that. So I'm trying to be very careful with the history in the repository so that readers can follow what I'm doing.
Sure, that makes sense. We'll add all of those links to the description on the page too. So perfect. I'm kind of curious. Do you think, with all of your knowledge you've built up at this point, would you write your own framework? Would you ever sit down and say, "I'm going to take on Solid.js and Quick and all these new ones coming up," or do you think it's just such a task that that's probably not something in your future?
I don't think I would. It is a lot of work. The frameworks today are super complex beasts. They have lots of features, they have lots of nuances, and you have to be super motivated to do that yourself. Like there are some very good frameworks like Vue with Evan U or Svelte with Rick Harris that they started the framework themselves, and once the framework was known in the community and lots of people were using it, then more people started to contribute to it, right? So in the beginning they were simple, but now they have some teams behind them, and they have turned those frameworks into really complex and really useful tools.
Yeah.
So to do that myself from scratch, I would need to learn so much, and I would need to be so motivated. And again, I'm a generalist, so I'm the kind of person who, instead of spending time learning absolutely everything that goes into a perfect framework, I prefer to spend time learning about, I don't know, something else. What
Yeah.
goes inside a database? These days, I'm super interested. There's an explosion of databases. Like there's so many, and they work so differently. And I also enjoy opening the source code and sometimes trying to understand how databases work. So I'm gonna probably spend time learning some other thing instead of just getting so deep so that I can build another framework.
Nice. I love it. Anything else I'm forgetting to ask about the book itself?
About the book.
Anything that might have went into it?
Mm,
I think we hit a lot of the big points. I just want to make sure there wasn't something like he's not asking me this.
No. I think we covered a lot of very interesting things. I cannot come up with anything that I feel it's important. So I
Okay.
guess we're
Well, I'm definitely excited for people to check out the book. I'll probably move this segment, so editor, pay attention. What we want to also announce is that I do have some codes. So when we release this episode, you'll be able to get the book at a very discounted price. I can't remember if I have one free one. If not, we'll make that happen somehow. So one lucky person could get the book. But I've read through a portion of it so far that's published. I really enjoy it, so it's really cool. Last but not least, what we're going to do is the thing that we call perfect picks. And I threw Angel for a little bit of a loop on this because it always kind of strikes somebody. And he has a really cool pick. So I'm going to put that up. Tell me all about this.
So this is a book that someone recommended me some time ago, and
It's called Fermat's Last Theorem.
correct.
Okay.
Correct. And I was like, I'm not sure this book is for me. But then I was in a bookstore and I saw it, and I didn't have any other option. And then I said, I'm gonna take it with me. I don't expect anything from this book, so I'm just taking it, and we'll see. But then it's one of the best books I've ever read because it blew my mind. Like it is based on a true story about Fermat. I'm a French mathematician. Well, he wasn't a mathematician, but he did math on his free time. That in one of the books he was reading, he put one equation, and he said that he had a proof for that, but the proof was very elegant, but he didn't have space to write it in the book. So what happened is that mathematicians for a couple of, like, I think dozens of years tried to demonstrate that, but no one ever demonstrated that theorem. So, but there was one guy, one English person, I forgot his name, that after 15 years of trying, he finally demonstrated the theorem. So there's like a lot going on in the story. It is extremely fun, and it is one of the books that surprises me the most. So what I like about books is that they surprise me.
Yeah.
So I like to take a book, not expect much from it, and then boom, you get mind blown by something you didn't expect. So this was the book that mind blew the most, and I really love it, and I think I definitely recommend it for everyone.
That's really cool. So am I getting it right? Like he wasn't able to put the theorem into the book and then he passed away?
He put the theorem, but theorems need a proof, right? A mathematical proof. And he said, I have the proof, but it doesn't fit here. So I'm not putting it. And my proof is super elegant. And the equation is extremely simple. So simple that when you look at it, you're like, I mean, come on, this has to be easy to prove. And then the best mathematicians ever in history, including Euler, and the big ones tried and failed. Like we're talking about the greatest mathematicians ever, and they failed. And they were like, look, Fermat was lying. This cannot be true. He didn't have a proof. He was lying. But then it took 15 or so years for this Englishman to demonstrate the theorem finally. And the demonstration had, like, I think 500 pages of math, something like that.
Wow.
It's crazy. I heard that only 3 or 4 people on earth have been able to follow the proof and say it's solid. So it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing.
It's like a Goodwill Hunting story right there.
It
Holy
is.
smokes. Cool. My pick's not nearly that powerful or interesting, but I've found it kind of cool. So we were talking at work the other day about how you can write some like Chrome extensions and things like that. And one of my colleagues is working on a really neat one. I don't want to give it away just in case he's like surprising people about it. But he's like, hey, I'm using this thing called Plasmo to create it. And it's like this full development framework for browser extensions. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. So I checked it out a little bit. It's really neat. I haven't had time to dive into it fully, but it is a really easy way to like kind of snap into that like programming language and put something out there really simply. So definitely check it out if you're interested at all about browser extensions.
That's nice.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book with us. I know like it's still kind of in progress. Is there like a hard date that we have, or is it kind of like you'll get it, it's electronic, and when I get done, I get done?
Well, I have a date, but I forgot.
Okay.
But for sure, there's going to be minimum 1 chapter per month, minimum. I hope to have more than one. But so yeah, you'll have lots of content to read and lots of code to write and lots of fun for sure.
Nice. Yeah, I know the like final product expectation of publication is spring of 24, but there's so much there already.
Could be.
Nice.
Yeah. Could
Okay,
be.
cool. Well, thanks, Angel. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your book with us.
Thank you for having me. It was really fun to be here with you.
Take care.
Take care.